that seems like we have a very shy audience today because nobody wants to sit close to us. But apart from that, we decided to make the format a little bit different than some of the other panels that has been. So I will ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and unfortunately we miss one gentleman, our representative from India. But I will ask them to introduce themselves, and after that I will give them 5 minutes each for a very short kind of what I call an ecosystem introduction. And then we will try to have a debate up here together with you to ask questions, to be slightly more interactive. That sound good for you? Anyone nodding? More coffee? Stronger coffee? Oh, Australia is always there. With that, I hand over to my contestants then, and I start. Please introduce yourselves.
Contestants, wow. What do I win? Good morning, everybody. My name is Bruce Gustafson. I run the policy shop here in Washington, D.C. for Ericsson, a little communications company. Hopefully you've heard of us. Popular in Europe, maybe not as well known over here. We will be talking about IoT today. My background hopefully lends itself to the discussion. I used to be an engineer, but over the years I've picked up a degree in business and a law degree. So I'm happy to take it in almost any direction. I'm not an expert in anything, but I certainly have lots of opinions to share. So with that.
Great, thank you. Good morning, I'm Matt Jennings. I'm the regional president for the American market for Bosch Software Innovations. Software innovations within Bosch, people may know Bosch as a provider of appliances and power tools, but there's a lot more than that. We are a division of Bosch focused 100% on IoT technology and solutions for both internally and externally to Bosch. We have about 700 engineers focused on IoT solutions. We focus those engineers on the energy market, developing smart city initiatives, connected vehicles, both on-road and off-road, and also the manufacturing market. And so what we'll talk about here today is how we go to market, work with some of the telecommunications providers, some of the carriers, and how we architect some of those solutions to add value to the end users.
Good morning. My name is Aaron Burstein, and I am an attorney advisor to Commissioner Julie Brill at the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, which is about 6 blocks east of here down Pennsylvania Avenue. I'll explain a little bit more about what the FTC does, but for now I'll say that I advise Commissioner Brill, who's one of 4 sitting commissioners at the FTC right now, on a wide range of consumer protection matters, including a lot of privacy and data security issues. So we really fit into the IoT puzzle where devices interface with consumers, and I will say much more about that during the panel.
Morning, friends. My name is R.S. Sharma. I'm the chairman of the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. And as the regulator of the telecom sector, we are also supposed to regulate all the things related to carrier of the telecom, which obviously will include IoT also. I have been a recent entrant to this job. I joined about 2 months back, so obviously I'm still learning on the job, but I think we will get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I will ask Bruce to start with his first 5 minutes introduction.
Okay, and there's been a lot of threats here. I'm staying within the clock, so I'll do my best.
Yeah.
I'll do my best. So I thought I would cover off 3 things just in, sort of lay the groundwork here so we have a spirited discussion. So first off, I'm going to talk about, what is it we're talking about today? So what is IoT? I think we all think we know that, but I'm going to sketch something that maybe sounds a little different to you. I'll talk about where we are today, and then where do we go from here? All that in 5 minutes. So first off, what are we talking about? I think there are 2 camps or 2 schools that look at IoT from different viewpoints. So there is what I'll call the communications world that looks out and says, okay, we're going to build something which is billions of devices communicating with each other. And when you come at it with that mindset, you tend to key on the sort of the interface and the traffic and how do things talk. And so that is your bias. You're trying to solve a problem of how do I connect all these things. On the other side, I think there's an IT community and IT bias that looks at this as just we already have an internet, everything talks to it, everything already, and all we're going to do is expand that. So it's a much, much bigger internet, in which case you're more interested in protocols, data flows, et cetera, and less interested in how do things connect, right? So we have these two worlds who kind of, have a slightly different view, but probably come to a similar viewpoint, I guess, or at least a similar set of problems and are working through them. I'm going to engage in just a quick little thought experiment because I think IoT is something slightly different than that. So quick question for the group. How many people here have heard of the computer game SimCity? Okay, so enough people, so we're familiar. So the idea of the game is, you are sort of the fictitious mayor. You have this simulation in front of you. You put down roads. You kind of define zoning. The computer simulation sort of builds up a city, and it thrives. Or, if you haven't planned ahead and you don't put a fire department in the right place, it burns down. That sort of stuff. But it's all sort of built on this simulation. So let's take that thought and let's extrapolate a little bit. And instead of the computer sort of building up the simulation, let's picture billions of sensors inside a city. So that the city that we're looking at on the screen is actually a representation of a real city, right? So we have data from cars and stoplights and everything, and that's feeding this little simulation. So I have a little virtual city which maps exactly to the real city, right? So that's step one. Step two. What if, now that virtual simulation that I can kind of see a virtual city, what if I now have the ability to, through control mechanisms and actuators back in the city, to use that simulation, that virtual city, to control the real city, right? So now I have a mechanism where I have a complete virtual software version of a city, everything that's moving, everything that's reacting, and I can, in real time, make intelligent decisions through software to go out and change that reality, modify the world. That's what the Internet of Things is, right? It is SimCity applied to real cities using real data in real time. A much bigger challenge, I think, than just connecting billions of devices. So if that's kind of a vision of where we're going, where are we today, I think there's probably 3 steps we're going to go through. The first, we've already started down the path. It is mobile phones, it is the app environment, and we're already getting to this place where at least we as people have sensors, we carry them with us, they have an awful lot of information about us, that's going up in the cloud, and the application environment is taking advantage of that. Stage 2 is probably moving into what I'll call what I'll characterize as the shared economy, where we are now taking other assets. Let's say it's rooms in a city. We're virtualizing those, so I have data on rooms in a city, and now I can act on that data, and I can take, virtual customers, virtual rooms. I can map the two together, and I have sort of an ecosystem that works. So that's sort of the shared economy. I think that's sort of step 2. Step 3 is that one where everything talks to everything. So I would argue we're maybe a third of the way along the S-curve towards what IoT eventually looks like.
Okay.
I'm going to be cut off.
Yeah, I told you, 5 minutes.
So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'm from Sweden. We care about these things.
That's good. That's good.
Are you going to talk more?
No, I'm good. I'm done. We'll talk later.
Oh, you will?
Absolutely.
So I will ask you a question instead.
Sure.
What is the biggest threat to this brand new world of IoTs?
I mean, that one's easy, right? Because it's the whole trust model. It's privacy. It's, if we take all this data and it goes virtual and it's all available, arguably, to sort of all of these other systems, if we can't find a way to build in consumer trust and to build in the security we need, then that whole thing does not happen, right? We always picture a utopia where my data is safe and yours is safe and neither of it mixes.
So you need more legislation?
I would like to think we can solve this through some technical means, I think, are required. I think we need to look at sort of the value of information, and we need to find what are the legal norms that allow information in the virtual world to behave like, information in the real world. I'm a big fan of trade secret law and that sort of stuff applied in that space. So I think we can get there. I would hope there'll have to be some regulation, but I'm hoping it's just an extension of what we do in the real world and nothing big and brand new.
Anyone from the panel would like to comment or ask a question?
I want to make a comment, and I think echo the idea. When the first IoT initiative I did was in 2001. We put it on a cellular network. That cell module was about $700, and it cost us about $40 a month to connect. Fast forward to where we are today, the cell module is $40, and it's about 30 cents a month to connect. So what we're seeing is the opportunity to connect those things that weren't connected. So I think to add to what he was saying, there's a lot of data being generated today. Bosch as an organization is the largest manufacturer of MEMS sensors in the world. We manufacture 2 million sensors a day that go into cell phones, that go into manufacturing, that go into automotive. So you think about each one of those sensors sending out data, there's a need for policy likely around that. There's a need for standards, there's a need for security. If you start to get into the different verticals around medical device, healthcare, much set of different requirements from a customer perspective than there are, say, around vehicle or around smart city. So I think I echo that. I think there's technologies we can put in place to help solve for this, but it's also likely going to require some standards and maybe some policy.
Any questions from the audience to Bruce, or is it too early still? Anyone else from the panel?
I think the broad category of challenges will be, one will be technological challenges, which I think that will mean the security of the data, the privacy, and interoperability, standards, etc., that technology part. Another is going to be legal. Basically what will happen, where the data resides, how the data travels, and if there are disputes, who actually decides, because it's all international, it's without boundaries. So that's another part. And third, I think, is regulatory, because how you define standards, how you kind of regulate this entire thing, and that regulatory should not become some kind of obstruction to the development of the sector. At the same time, it should develop in a healthy manner. It should not create silos of, sort of systems which don't talk to each other. So I think regulatory will also have to take care of interoperability, standards, and other technological challenges also in some sense. So these are the three broad areas which I see as the challenges in the IoT.
So I have a comment about regulators then.
Yes, please have.
So I mean, I think just like everyone else is going to sort of retool and re-engineer in IoT, I think regulators have an opportunity, if you will, to do the same thing. We've had conversations about whether operators' business model is changing, whether they recognize that. I think a regulator's business model potentially is changing. So picture that, that future city where everything is connected, and we'll talk about the transport system, and we'll talk about, we have all these cars, we have all these traffic lights, we have all this information about how traffic is flowing, et cetera, the cars themselves are talking. What is the role of the Department of Transport in that scenario? And I could see a future where there is a cloud-based system, right, which is monitoring all of that sort of traffic flow and optimizing and making sure that the right people are going to the right place and that the rules are followed, and that service is offered by DOT. So that DOT becomes the FAA of the future. They are orchestrating the flow of surface transportation, and it's a service that the government offers. Tap into the cloud, and we will make sure that everything gets there efficiently.
If I went home and said that PTS, the authority I'm running, had a business idea, I think I would have had some challenges to that one.
It'll take a change in mindset.
Yeah, I don't think I have one. But do you see this world, just a final question to you before we move on. But you work for Ericsson, which is a wireless company.
I did this morning, I hope I still do.
I haven't seen anything that you did.
That's good.
But how do you, we all know there is a kind of struggle in between how do you connect those devices? Is it going to be primarily wireless technology using SIM cards, or will it be IP-based, IP numbering that we collect them to, or will it be something in between?
Yeah, and I think that the IT world and the communications world have different views there.
That's why I brought it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of work to be done there. I think a comment on talking about sort of cellular standards, and let's take it a step further. Anything that if we're going to count on stuff to be connected all the time, I think we are all building intelligent systems where they will take advantage of the lowest cost connection that meets the requirements. They will, as quickly as possible, trying to get onto fiber, et cetera. There will always be cases where things are, too far for Wi-Fi or too far for Bluetooth, and the cellular system needs to provide the umbrella coverage, and we're busy working on 5G to make sure that we have the capabilities to do that. I think the bigger question is going to be, how do we allocate the value of that connectivity, right? How is it, how do you measure, if I have a little sensor in a field someplace, I can't say that is, the value of connectivity is high, the value of connectivity in a car is high, but relative to the price of the car, the connectivity is a trivial item. That sensor out there, connectivity is kind of what really makes it work. And so, we're going to have to work through, how do you allocate that value? How does licensing and things like that work? And those are going to be tough debates, I think, going forward.
I agree. They're going to be fun debates. Anyone would like to ask any questions from the audience to Bruce before we move on? Will?
Hello. Connecting on your last point about... hello?
Yep.
My name is Nader Khalil. I'm from a regulatory authority in Egypt. Relating to your last point about how you build on the value or how the value will be segmented between all the players, how do you see the business model that is that is going to be happening as a result of Internet of Things?
Yeah, I don't. I think we're in a great phase of experimentation, right? I think a lot of people, today there's an awful lot of connectivity that's based around some sort of an advertising model, right? We collect information and we exchange personal information for, some advertising ability. I think we see that that's under threat today. People are, blocking ads, et cetera, and Google and others are trying to figure out what the path forward is there. I think it's clear that there is societal value and probably, business value in some of these connections. If I have a sensor in a field that enables a tractor to recognize that it's putting down too much or not enough herbicide, it's good for the environment, it saves money in terms of, chemicals, et cetera. So there's clearly, real value and real money that's saved and is enabled by that. The question is, is there then some subscription that, whoever put the sensor in is paid some subscription value? Is it that, as part of a farm prescription herbicide service that you pay a monthly fee and this is all owned by some big agribusiness? I think all those things are being experimented with. I think, we had a little conversation earlier about what the role of a farmer will be in the future. And it may be that all they do is own land assets and provide equity, and that everything else is automated or outsourced through cloud services and various sensor networks that enable that. So a ton of experimentation to come. I would urge the regulators in the room to let some of that happen, because we know there's value, we just don't know how it will be captured.
Thank you.
That was a long answer, sorry.
It was a good answer. We'll probably come back to the business models of the carriers and the operators going down to this discussion, and it's a thought then that Matthew, who is actually an over-the-top player, we realize that, will now take the floor.
Well, I think a couple of comments, especially on business model. We work with organizations on a regular basis outside of Bosch to help them understand how to leverage and connect to assets. A lot of times those assets are what we call lazy assets that are in the field, have no connectivity, no ability to communicate. We need to instrument those assets to bring that data back into an organization. I think when we talk about business models as an example, the biggest thing that needs to happen is we need to think creatively about how do we utilize this data in the business for the value of the business. Make the business more sustainable, extract cost, enhance communications, really provide that integration between the supply chain and the demand chain. A lot of manufacturers, for example, that we work with will sell a product through a dealer network. Once it goes to the dealer network, they lose sight of that asset, where it goes, how it's used, how it's maintained. What this connectivity allows them to do is not only track the quality of the asset as it's manufactured, but as it goes out into the field, they then have interaction with the end user, which is something they've never had before. Now they need to start to change their business interaction with that end user, with the asset, and they're starting to change their business models. And maybe they're selling the asset on a per-use basis, or maybe they're selling it on a lease-type basis. But it's really changing the business models from a product mentality to more of a services mentality. I think if you look at the ecosystem of the players in the market, whether it be the gateway providers selling hardware, the network providers, the enterprise systems providers, the cloud providers, it's changing their models as well. The enterprise system providers no longer have a user that's a human interface sitting at a desk implementing data. Now you have non-human interfaces coming into those assets. And so they're having to change the model about how they cost their licensing, how they price, how they deliver in the cloud. So there's a radical change about business becoming digital, and there's a lot of creative thinking we need to apply in our business models about how we address that.
I think I have to admit I wasn't aware how big Bosch were in this area. And one of the things that many people talk about as the backdrop of the kind of discussion about everything is going to get connected is privacy and security. Is that a big issue for your customers today, or is it something that you have to push for them? Do they understand that problem?
Well, they do understand it, and it is a big issue. And I think it changes based on who the customer is, and it also certainly changes based on what vertical industry that they're in. We have some opportunities in healthcare market right now, working with med device. It's a radically different discussion around protecting patient data, connecting the device, especially if it's a life-saving type of device, and the security that you have to have around that device. You move into a vehicle environment, the security's a little bit different there, but still it needs to be secure so you don't have, for example, future autonomous driving, things being taken over, those types of things. You get into a factory environment, you need to have clear, secure firewall environments set up so that you have an isolated factory environment, but then you have a network that's allowing the transmission of this data. We address that through technology, we address that through strong identity management type of capabilities, and we also address it through our partner companies as well.
Any questions comments from the panel?
I think as far as the context in India is concerned, the basic areas which we are considering to kind of initial areas will be agriculture, health, especially the social areas, health, education, for example. Now, their security is extremely important because, as you know, if the systems don't work and in a secure manner, it is important. Privacy in some of the areas like agriculture and other things may not be that important part, but nevertheless in health and education it will be certainly very important. So it will depend on the sector-specific application of the IoT as to what is the level of individual privacy. But overall, in general, obviously, I feel that the big data analytics, when it comes to it, should be, obviously, it can be as open as possible so that it lends itself to analytics and all kinds of research, etc. But individual data, obviously, will have to be protected.
Before this conference, we had a regulatory conference as well with only regulators in the room. And we are a fun bunch of people. Why did anyone smile about that? It's fun what we do. But it comes back to one of the theses we had, as you take everything else out, connectivity seems to be fairly important to achieve this. That, to be able to this brand new world, we need a lot of more connectivity, which leads to, and I really would like to hear more about your perspective about the business models in this now, coming in as this is an old joke from me. I don't like the word over-the-top providers or over-the-top players, because for me that means that the operators are the plumbers or under-the-floor providers. Yeah, I know that carriers really like that joke. But it's really because it's actually application and service providers we talk about, which is very, very different in the new world. So, but what is your view on the future business models when it comes to this relationship? And especially if you can help us regulators to talk about what you think the carrier's role would be. And nobody will tell if you say anything that, it's video stream, by the way. Just keep within the scope.
I think it's interesting as you look at digitization, and IT is definitely part of it. If you look at the business models that are coming out today, the largest fleet company in the world, Uber, owns no vehicles. They own technology. The largest hotelier in the world owns no buildings. And so we're starting to look at what they own is data, and what they own is access across the network. So I think the carrier and the telecom providers become more important in that. But there's also the opportunity for them to add additional value and features to make the data more available, more reliable, more secure. I think as we talk business models to some of our customers, they're starting to see some of those business models changing. How do they engage with their customer? How do they get them to be more loyal to their brand? How do they sell, for example, the higher margin components like parts and service, as opposed to selling the asset that goes out into the field? And is the model changing to where they will give the asset away and then provide subscription-based services to that asset. So it's drastically changing. I don't think we've seen what it's ultimately going to look like yet. I think the idea of Uber is just an example of things that are happening in the market. And I think there's a generation today that sees less about owning assets and more about sharing assets. And I think that's going to continue to evolve and it's going to continue to change.
Anyone from the audience would like to ask a question? I have loads of questions, so, okay, there's one. A fellow regulator.
Good morning. I am, I think. My question relates to connectivity and the ubiquity of this world that we're entering into. As a regulator, I think we all look at net neutrality, open access of networks as ranking right up there with human rights in that this is a network that is being used on an unrestricted basis by the public for personal and commercial gain. But as we start looking at Internet of Things and we start looking at the multipliers, you know, the numbers that I've been seeing in various conferences are overwhelming. We, all of a sudden, my mind wants to go to, not to a regulated scenario, but a managed scenario. And governments, I think, around the world are very hesitant to even discuss the topic, let alone enter into discussions. But as industry players, Bosch, Ericsson, and the like, have you guys run the numbers with respect to how these devices, which are much more utilitarian than the internet is being used en masse today, have you run the numbers to see whether this is an industry problem that can be solved through either shared networks that are proposed by industry or perhaps even the building of a utility network? I'm thinking very much along the lines of spectrum when we have this finite resource and at a certain point we carve off pieces of it for utilitarian purposes and build these utility networks that the public don't have access to, but they serve the public. So everyone that I've been hearing for years, sorry to run on, but industry has been looking to the regulator, and I think the regulator looks back at the industry and says, what's your business model? And have you run the numbers to see if there is the economic argument to build out utility networks, or do you have another proposal?
Thank you.
Yeah, this could be a very long discussion, but
We have some time.
yes, we've looked at the numbers from our perspective. We looked at it from different vertical industry perspectives. If you look at, for example, carrier networks, which we tend to rely on, there's some limitations there. Sometimes there's limitations in the economic limitations. Sometimes there's limitations in the technology. That's why you see Bosch as an organization looking at things like long-range networks, like Bluetooth technology, Wi-Fi. If you look at it, for example, from a smart city perspective, and the number of devices that have the opportunity to connect, it's not economically viable to connect those to a cellular network. Now, theoretically, that's the idea to do it because everything's connected and you don't have to run the wires and the infrastructure and the cost of installation and all of those types of things. What becomes more important is, can you just pop up an antenna 2 or 3 around a city that has a range of 30 miles, and then can you cover a major metropolitan area and then connect those things? You run into some limitations there as far as bandwidth and being able to go bi-directional. So if there's opportunities to add additional bandwidth, for example, in a city environment, or that's not dedicated to the public but dedicated for industry, for public consumption, I think those are all good ideas and are going to be needed in the future. If that doesn't happen, you're going to see alternative type of private networks pop up, and that's going to change the economics for the end users as well.
I was just waiting for someone to say something about net neutrality and then move on and go into spectrum. There's another gentleman? Another regulator.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Göran. My name is Andy Hare. I'm actually going to raise a question that potentially could be a bit more sobering, because for the last 3, 5, 7 years, we've heard so much about this and so much about the opportunity. I'm going to try to bring a bit of, if I could, a bit of reality. There's been an awful lot written in the academic press in the last maybe 12 to 18 months about a concept called de-skilling. And de-skilling is the fact that as people, we are tending to rely heavily on automation. And let me bring this to a very sobering example. I guess it was in 2010, there was a flight between Sao Paulo and Paris, Air France 447, where the pilots relied so heavily on the automation of that aircraft that in the post-crash analysis, it was determined that the pilot in charge had all of 4 minutes of experience with the event that took place. So this is, as I said, a fairly sobering example of what the concept of de-skilling is all about. I'd be curious to hear the comments of the panel in terms of, with all this vast opportunity and all this public good that we're going to have, what are you doing specifically about the de-skilling issue, or even have you looked at it? Thank you. Thank you, Göran.
I'll let Bosch answer that question, and then we will probably come back to it. I just want to say we regulators don't get de-skilled. I just want you to know that.
So I think you bring up a very valid point. One of the things that we manage on a regular basis is what we call alarm fatigue. If you think about and you recall the Deepwater Horizon, there were alarms going off on that all day long. People were used to hearing them, they ignored them. So what you have then is people are not reacting to the things that they're supposed to react to. It becomes mundane in their life, they're hearing these alarms. It happens in industries all over, we see it everywhere. We see it all the way down to a restaurant environment where the cooler is alarming and nobody's doing anything about it because they send, it always alarms. So we need to change the discussion about, you know, what's the process by which you activate an alarm? How do you cascade those alarms throughout the environment? And how do you react to those? So I do think there is an element to it of de-skilling. We had a conversation this morning about where agriculture is going, precision ag. You know, gone are the days where the farmer gets on the tractor and tills the field and plants the corn. Now all they're doing is sitting in an environment, GPS is guiding the field, you know, the trailer is following along behind by electronic means as well, and you really don't have the interaction. So, you know, is there a future generation of farmers that will have no idea how to even put a shovel into the ground? It's likely the case. And the evolution is going towards they do know how to understand and read GPS and, you know, program their cell phone. But I think it's a valid issue. I think we're losing some skill because of the automation and the technology that's enabling the simplicity of what we're doing.
That's a very interesting thought, by the way. With that, I will floor over to Aaron.
Thank you, and I'd like to come back to that thread in the discussion as well. First, I should say that I'm here only representing my own opinion, not that of any FTC commissioner or the commission as a whole. So with that out of the way, I might want to back up a little bit and explain a few things about the FTC that make us different from a lot of regulators, especially those in the telecom and communications space. We really have two missions at the FTC. They are consumer protection and competition, and we share competition authority with the Department of Justice. I work on consumer protection matters, so that's where I'll focus most of my remarks. We have, as our Magna Carta, if you will, the FTC Act, which is 100 years old. It provides us with broad authority to stop unfair or deceptive acts or practices. So it's not specific to any sector. We have certain industries that are carved out of our authority, but we have very broad authority over wide swaths of the U.S. economy. And we have brought cases in all of those areas. If I would point to one very important distinction between the FTC and a lot of other agencies, it's that we rely very heavily on our enforcement power and enforcing against companies that have crossed the line into unfair or deceptive acts or practices. we really don't have much of a role in terms of ex-ante regulation, approving devices before they go to market, or those sorts of things. So we're sort of an ex-post force, and I think the structure of the agency allows a lot of gray area in terms of developing business practices where we go after companies that cross the line into unfairness or deception, but there's a lot of activity that can emerge and take shape that is not on the wrong side of the line. In terms of the IoT itself, I always hate to pile onto agreement on a panel, but the FTC has identified privacy and data security as two of the top issues concerning the Internet of Things. We've done a full report on those issues. We've held public workshops that looked at connected cars, the connected home, user-generated health data and user-controlled health devices, so things that are outside of the medical device realm. And I think if one basic theme emerges from all of those activities, it's that the agency has taken the view that basic consumer protection principles apply even to these new technologies. Applying those principles is not without its challenges, but it's really a question of how to apply them and not whether they apply. So let me give you just a couple of examples. One is that even as device interfaces shrink or become non-existent, we still believe that there's a very important role for consumers to become informed about what sorts of data are being collected about them and what's happening with it. So we have tried to steer companies' attention toward finding different ways to notify consumers, different ways to get consent, and I can go into detail about that. We've also found that there's a perception that the agency will only go after companies after they've made a specific representation about their data security. That's not actually the case. Under our unfairness authority, if a company fails to take reasonable measures to protect personal data, that is potentially something that we can go after, even if they've made no statement about what sorts of protections they'll provide. So those are some of the tools that we have to work with and some of the basic perspective that we have. I would just close by saying that as broad as our authority is, we still fit into a larger government picture. There are law enforcement agencies that do more specific types of enforcement. There are state and local issues that come up, and certainly also foreign issues, and we're wrestling with all of those.
Thank you. I mean, we are fellow regulators.
Yes.
Do you sometimes feel that the industry doesn't have the understanding of the importance of privacy and information security? Are they easy to work with, or do they sue you all the time?
Well, we tend to be on the other side of most of the litigation that we handle. I would say that there's a very widespread agreement that we hear, at least in principle, about the importance of privacy and data security. I think that the companies up here and many, many other companies fully and genuinely say that this is an issue of trust, and without consumers' trust, they're in a very difficult position. Where the conversation gets a little trickier is when you talk about what approach is best to strengthen that trust or maintain that trust. In particular, to go back to a question that came up before, do we need additional laws? Do we need more regulation? That's really where I think you lose a lot of the agreement. The FTC has taken the view that IoT-specific legislation or regulation probably at this point doesn't seem like the way to go, but we have called for baseline privacy legislation, which is something that the United States doesn't have, as well as data security legislation. So those are more general instruments that people tussle over, but in terms of the basic agreement about the importance of privacy and data security, I think those are very widespread.
Any comments or questions from the panel? You have the opportunity now.
I mean, I'll wade in on privacy and this, just because this is one that sort of, and maybe this is industry and regulators sort of debating a concept, but you know, I always try to look forward to sort of some utopian state. How would we want IoT to work? And, you know, if everything was working perfectly, what would it look like? And then sort of back up to say, how do we get there, right? And I guess I would challenge a little bit sort of our concept of, or I guess how we're implementing privacy today and how perhaps we would like the world to work. And I'll use the model of, you know, if I share information with my doctor, you know, I expect it to be held in confidence, right? But that doesn't mean that, you know, sort of absolute confidence. I sort of expect my doctor to use that information in my best interests. And so if there's, for instance, a big study that talks about, you know, can we aggregate information from a bunch of people like me and that will lead to, you know, brilliant new cures or something, you know, as long as my doctor sort of is keeping an eye on my stuff and they're the expert, I'm sort of okay with them doing that because it's net benefit to me, right? You know, we need to, I think we need to find some model wherein there is, you know, confidence in the rights and obligations of, you know, my data and the people I entrust my data to, such that it is used in my best interests throughout the system, right? The IT community will tell you IoT works because we have data, right? It's the massive data we need, right? And so, you know, we need to find our way through this privacy, security kind of thing to a place where data is mobile, where it's, you know, there are stewards in place, there's rights and obligations in place, but, you know, I think the current regulatory regime is a little restrictive in trying to sort of get us to that world.
All right.
Well, so I would, I guess, challenge I agree that having confidence in the protections that a data steward or a data controller has is a good result. That's something we should all hope for, but the question is, how do you build that confidence? How do you establish it? I think what you were getting at is that some of the traditional mechanisms for protecting privacy, so providing notice, getting consumer choice, that would be an infeasible way to proceed with the Internet of Things because of the number of devices, the number of different folks who are collecting data, all of that. I think there's an important role for it, but what we have said at the FTC is that we really encourage companies to think through carefully about what's meaningful and to think in terms of the context in which consumers use devices. So to take one example, a connected car. I think if you look at it from the perspective of someone buying and driving an automobile and what they expect about what sorts of information will be collected to support the services that they use in the car, you get a much better sense of what type of notice is appropriate, what type of sharing with third parties potentially would be appropriate for that context. So that's a standard that I think is very helpful from a design and governance perspective. It's harder to reduce to statutory language. So that's one thing that I think is a long-term debate that's going on. But I think there are also important forms of privacy protection that are not just notice and choice. So there are instances where providing access to data and allowing people to correct it are very powerful tools and ways to prevent harm to consumers. So those are other things to keep in mind. And I would just mention one last thing, which is the role of de-identification of data. That takes things outside of the realm that the FTC at least is generally concerned about. And I think there's a lot of interest in finding practical ways to do it. I think, a hotly contested technical issue. We've recommended different contractual and organizational ways to get a control on that, but I think that can also play a very important role in providing data that can provide a lot of these broader social benefits.
I think there's, I'll toss out the one comment that there's an awful lot of research on re-identification of data by taking multiple data sets and recombining it. So right. I worry that that we can never get there. There's no there. We can't get to the point where things are de-identified if big data sets can come together.
Right, and our answer to that has been, if you throw data over the wall and let anyone have it, do anything with it, yes, that's certainly a very real threat model. If you're dealing with situations where you can have contracts and public commitments that are enforceable as to the data source and all of the recipients, then I think there's a much greater comfort level in having reasonable but not bulletproof de-identification serve as the basis for sharing de-identified data.
Thank you. We had a question there from Australia.
Aaron, I've been banging on for years about the desire of having in Australia a Converged Communications Act. And then you've opened up a whole new field with, I think, your reference to the fact that you've considered, although haven't gone on with a discussion about an act to deal with the Internet of Things, or legislation. I think you said that about 10 minutes ago. What led to that thought? What was the sort of things that informed the discussion or the assessment at this stage that that probably wasn't a road that could be pursued at the moment, because that oxygenates the thought processes about where we're going? And is legislation or frameworks or regulatory constructs that would deal with the Internet of Things, is that something well beyond the concept of Converged Communications Acts?
Well, let me answer, I guess, the narrower question about what led to our recommendation not to pursue sort of IoT specific, and it was really privacy and data security legislation that we were talking about. I think that was really a matter of two things. One is that there's still somewhat of a definitional problem, and so if you just talk about IoT devices and not laptops or something like that, then you start to draw lines that are very technology specific and maybe don't make a lot of sense now or in a year or 5 years. The other thing is sort of specific to US law, where if you put IoT devices under a specific legislative regime governing privacy and data security, then things that aren't IoT devices and aren't part of any other sector-specific law wouldn't have comparable legislation. So you could potentially have data going between an IoT device that is covered by law and a laptop that is not. And we've thought that a broader approach just makes more sense. In terms of Converged Communications Acts, that's a little bit outside of my realm, so I don't know if other panelists want to take a shot at that, or if you can give me a little more to go on, I can try to give you a better answer.
Anyone else who would like? We have more questions. There and there. Use the microphone.
There's a mic on.
So I just want to pick up on the conversation you just had. So it sounds like here in the U.S., you don't have overarching privacy legislation. It sounds like you don't have sector-specific privacy legislation.
No, we do. We do have sector-specific.
Oh, sector-specific, okay. But in terms of the context of your discussion, FTC addresses privacy issues under the rubric of consumer protection legislation. Is that fair?
Right. Yes.
Okay. So when you apply your principles, and I imagine, based on what I've heard, you've got the standard principles of notice and consent and opt-in and opt-out, and then judgments are made based on how sensitive the information is. Is that fair?
Yeah.
More or less?
Fair.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in applying your principles and your standards, are different standards applied to telecom carriers versus other types of undertakings or social media sites, apps, grocery store, et cetera?
Well, so as to telecom carriers in particular, that's one sector that is carved out of our authority. So common carriers are not subject to the FTC Act. So we don't enforce the Unfair and Deceptive Acts and Practices Law. The FCC, Federal Communications Commission, has the authority over common carriers. But in terms of the others that you mentioned, I think you're right that we look at the sensitivity of the data. Our unfairness standard is really a three-part test. We look at whether there was a substantial injury to consumers, was it something that they could have avoided, and were there offsetting benefits to competition or consumers in the conduct that we're thinking of challenging. So that's a pretty flexible test that allows us to take a broad but not infinite view of the types of injuries that consumers could suffer through data breaches or through unexpected disclosures to third parties, and the sensitivity of data definitely plays a key role in that discussion, as well as whether there were ways to avoid it. So again, the principle of sensitivity of data is important, but that's always going to be a pretty fact-intensive discussion.
Thank you. I think it was a lady. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. Good morning. It's Carolyn Nguyen with Microsoft with a question for Aaron. One of the things that the FTC, I think, has done really well is to promote conversations about technologies and really open and running workshop sessions. And recently, the FTC has also established an office of a CTO and a technology office. I was wondering if you can address how that has helped in the process of policy development related to technologies and the IoT. And then secondly, also, one of the things about the IoT that you always hear about is it increases the vector of attacks. However, those additional vectors can also be used proactively in addressing security concerns, et cetera. Also, if you can, I wonder if you can also address that as well in the work.
Sure. So FTC public workshops, public comment processes, those are integral to the policy development work that we do. I think that we've built a fairly good track record of identifying emerging issues and structuring public discussions that bring in a really wide range of industry and academic and advocacy-oriented viewpoints to start more detailed discussions about the benefits of new technologies as well as some of the risks. So that was our starting point with the IoT about 2 years ago, and we've been building on it since then. In terms of security, you're absolutely right that the addition of devices that are connected to the network, and really, I think more importantly, that can be connected to accounts or credentials that consumers rely on for a lot of things like email addresses or financial accounts. That's something that personally I'm quite concerned about because I think a lot of services and the convenience side of consumer-oriented IoT devices depends on having those linkages, but also creates a way to find a weak link in the chain and compromise accounts that people use for authenticating themselves or for using their bank accounts and so forth. So I think the expansion of the attack surface is very real. At the same time, I think there's some movement toward having central points, say in the home, that can control different devices. That's driven in part by convenience, but I think it also provides a potential opening for consumers to have one place to go to manage data flows from their devices and potentially to address some of the security issues.
Thank you. I remember when a couple of years ago, or just 4 or 5 years ago, when we started talking about IoT, this discussion about privacy and security, it took a while until it actually started. But now it's really one of the most important ones. And by the way, if we have a couple of minutes at the end, I would like to hear your comments about the so-called safe harbor discussion, which we in Europe and the US have some interesting perspectives on right now. But now I would like to go over to one of the most fascinating countries in the world, in India, with a fellow regulator. But as you said, you've been in the job for 2 months.
Yeah.
So now you can tell us veterans how we do wrong.
Well, thank you very much. What I'll do is that I'd like to share with you what India perceives IoT to be, how useful it is going to be, and what are the policy frameworks which we have thus till now put in place, and how we see the challenges in this space, and what are the other issues which are important. So one is that the applications of IoT which we perceive, which is going to trigger off this, will be more into the social sectors, which is the health, education, retail, agriculture, transport, logistics. We also have now announced 100 smart cities, the new government which has come into power about a year back. And the whole idea is again based on the IoT part. So these smart cities project is going on, and then we are sort of coming up with newer and newer kind of challenges and issues. The draft policy on IoT which the government of India has announced, basically one, it says that we should create an industry of about $15 billion US by 2020. We should focus on capacity building in this space. We should undertake research and development for the assisting technologies, and to develop IoT product specific to India. Some of the what we have also done is that there is an industry association, software industry association in India called NESCOM, and the government of India has tied up with NESCOM to create a center of excellence for, specifically devoted to IoT. So there is a huge private-public partnership going on in this space. India is also creating something which is called BharatNet, or the National Optical Fiber Network. And what it is doing is, it is basically taking the optical fiber cables down to the villages. So in India, we have 600,000 villages, and we have identified 250,000 points of presence of this POPs of the BharatNet, which is what we call panchayats. A panchayat is like a village democracy, and it's a focal point of a couple of villages. So we feel that having this backhaul infrastructure, which is a gigabit sort of infrastructure, and you can take it to any level you want to because it's all optical fiber, this will provide a real backbone to the IoT space in agriculture, in health and education. So that part is taken care of. The real challenge which we see in that space is the cost of the devices, cost of the sensors. Because currently, a sensor will probably cost about $5. And if you want to have millions of these, obviously we will need to have the cost drastically down, and only then we can really have the developing countries like India can only have then the benefit of these devices. Then we have a very, very ambitious program of Digital India, which also fits in because we have created digital infrastructure, identity related. See, that's on the question of privacy, etc. We have now created 920 million numbers, digital identity numbers, which are unique and which are authenticable. And on the basis of these numbers, we are building a framework which is, online digital signatures. We are building a framework of the, kind of storage, digital storage. And most importantly, we are building a consent-based privacy framework where a person digitally authenticating will be able, data owner, so to say, will be able to provide consent either for a limited purpose or to limited agencies or to limited period. And this will be basically notice-based. So whenever a data relating to an individual is used, that person is necessarily notified. So I think having a digital identity infrastructure at the base of the entire framework is going to be a huge plus in the area of IoT. As I said before, I see three basic challenges. One is technological, legal and regulatory. And essentially technological, as I said, is interoperability, consumption of power of these devices, security, data security. These are some of the technological challenges. And regulatory and legal challenges obviously will be privacy and how do you tackle these issues. Quality of service will be another regulatory challenge, and how do you define that, interoperability. One thing which I would like to make it clear is that in the world where the service providers for these IoT-led applications, suppose there is an agriculture area and some entity and some agency is providing a solution based on IoT for agriculture, then obviously that solution is going to flow through a pipe, which is either telcos or the BharatNet or some other infrastructure. And unless you decouple these things, unless you sort of go to the basic principle of net neutrality, where these infrastructures become shareable in a non-discriminatory manner, you cannot really have a play. So it's important that we have a real decoupling of the pipe and the content, and there is a interconnect rule which the regulator will be able to decide. So I think ultimately the need and extent of regulatory intervention will be decided on how IoT industry comes up. Of course, it's too nascent. And what we are proposing is, in fact, I was yesterday talking to my Australian counterpart, and they are bringing out some basic checklist of things which the regulator would like to sort of look into in this space, because we are also not very clear as to what will be the specific areas of regulation. And obviously we are also conscious of the fact that regulation should not strangulate the sector. Regulation should promote and facilitate this technology. And therefore we would like to tread very cautiously. So we also bring out a consultation paper as to how we propose to regulate this.
Thank you. It's fascinating. I come from, obviously, one of the smallest countries on earth, and compared to India. And I learned a number just a couple of days ago, which I think is fascinating, that you every year you train the same amount of civil engineers every year that we ever have done so far in Sweden. Yeah. That's, says something about the numbers.
So talking of numbers, India has a population of 1.3 billion.
Yeah, we are 10 million.
We have we have 1 billion telephone connections. Mobile phones, 1 billion plus. Then of course there are other statistics. We have 920 million digital identities. And we think that once you get into agriculture and transport and other logistics, it will be huge numbers again in those IoT space.
Maybe we should move from the EU and join India instead. Maybe.
Absolutely.
Sweden has the Nobel Prize.
Yeah, we do.
It's important stuff.
Yes, very important right now. Yeah. One of the questions, the numbers are staggering, and I suppose there are two companies here at the panel who would like to help you to achieve your goals. But how do you interact with the private sector? Because you need so much resources and you need so much financial support to do it. And how is your interaction with industry on this one?
I think there is, in fact, in the entire IT space, the IoT is one O in between, but in the entire IT space, we have been interacting and interfacing with the private sector. And the entire solution architecture of many of these projects which have happened in IT space are done by private sector. On the outsourcing and BPO front, you may be aware that we have, Indian companies have 54% of the world's share. So therefore, there is a very, very vibrant culture of participation of the private sector in the entire space. And even the IoT also is not going to be an exception. IoT will not be done by the government. It will be done by the private sector, of course, within the parameters and policy framework given by the government.
Any comments or questions from the private sector? Nothing?
Not yet.
I'll comment on that. So I think everything I hear from the regulators, setting up the rules, et cetera, I think that it's good. I think there's always danger in going too far. There's danger in not sort of going far enough. I think we all agree on that IoT and broadly speaking, internet access and broadband and stuff are becoming so absolutely critical to the economy and social structure and stuff that it's hard just to leave it to chance, right? But I am always impressed by the variety of responses that governments sort of take to this. And the example that I'll throw out is I was listening to the president of Estonia over at the World Bank the other day, and Estonia is, maybe many of you know, a fully digitized government system, so sort of the mechanism to kickstart broadband and other things is to say, let's take all government services and they're all online, right? There's no paperwork everywhere. And it was fun because the regulation or the legal framework for that was, as an example, was an industry I kind of like this, so I guess as a consumer. They prohibit a government agency for asking for any information from a consumer that another agency already has. So if you change your address in Estonia, one place, right? No other agency can ever ask you for that information because the assumption is it's in the network. They all need, it needs to be incorporated and move forward. I contrast that with, sort of a world where the mandate gets pushed down to industry, right? To begin to, structure things or report or change or whatever. And so I guess my message for regulators is, it's one thing, making rules and making sure we follow the rules is good. At the same time, do everything you can to create benefits and to create an ecosystem that encourages industry likewise to kind of, come in behind and build the support that you need to automate services that you're offering. So.
There's a gentleman down there.